My wife confessed her affair was with a loan shark who she gave our house to as collateral. I replied, "That's a problem." Then I reported him to the cops. She was left frantically calling me from the station. I, 32M, thought I knew my wife until 3 weeks ago when she destroyed everything I believed about our marriage with a single confession that turned my blood cold. It started with the usual signs: late nights, secretive phone calls, new clothes I hadn't seen her buy, the distant look in her eyes when we made love, like she was somewhere else entirely. I'd been married for 8 years, and I wasn't stupid. When your wife starts acting like a stranger in your own home, there's usually another man involved. What I didn't expect was the rest of it. I'd been tracking her movements for 2 weeks, collecting evidence like some discount private investigator. Screenshots of mysterious text messages, receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, the smell of cologne that wasn't mine clinging to her hair. I was building a case in my head, preparing for the inevitable confrontation about her affair. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening. She walked into our kitchen where I was eating dinner alone, again, and sat down across from me with that look people get when they're about to confess to murder. She told me she had something important to discuss. Her voice was shaking, and she couldn't meet my eyes. I set down my fork and waited, thinking I was ready for whatever she was about to say. She started by admitting there was another man. My stomach dropped, even though I'd been expecting it. But then she kept talking, and the story became something entirely different from what I'd imagined. She explained that 6 months ago, she'd gotten involved with gambling. Online poker at first, then sports betting, then more complicated schemes that I didn't fully understand. She'd lost our savings account without telling me, then moved on to credit cards, maxing out every line of credit we had. I sat there listening, feeling like the floor was disappearing beneath my feet. She continued, telling me about how desperate she'd become when the debts started piling up. She'd found someone through her gambling connections, a man who offered to help with her situation. This man, she explained, wasn't just someone she was sleeping with. He was a loan shark who had been providing her money to cover her gambling debts and living expenses. The affair part, she said, was just part of their arrangement. He'd made it clear that physical intimacy was expected in exchange for his financial assistance. My hands were shaking as she described how this arrangement had been going on for months. But then came the part that made me want to vomit. She told me that 2 weeks ago, when her debts had grown beyond what she could handle with just the money he was giving her, he'd suggested a more permanent solution. She'd signed papers putting our house up as collateral for a massive loan, something close to $200,000. I asked her if she was telling me that our home, the house we'd bought together, where we'd planned to raise children, was now essentially owned by her loan shark boyfriend. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. She tried to explain that she'd thought she could win it back, that she had a system, that this was all temporary. She begged me to understand that she never meant for things to go this far. I stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at our neighborhood, trying to process what I'd just heard. My wife hadn't just cheated on me. She'd sold our life to a criminal and was paying him back with her body. I turned back to her and asked if she had any documentation of this arrangement. She pulled out her phone and showed me text messages, bank statements, and photos of documents she'd signed. Everything was there, laid out in devastating detail. I told her that this was definitely a problem, but not the kind of problem she probably thought it was. She looked at me confused, probably expecting me to scream or throw things or break down crying. Instead, I asked her for his name, his address, any information she had about his operation. She hesitated, clearly terrified of what he might do if she betrayed him. I explained that she'd already betrayed everyone who mattered, so she might as well be thorough about it. She gave me everything: his full name, where he lived, where he conducted business, the names of other people involved in his network. She even had photos of him, recordings of some of their conversations, and detailed records of their financial transactions. I thanked her for the information and told her I needed some time to think about our situation. She asked what I was planning to do, and I told her she'd find out soon enough. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I spent hours researching everything I could about loan sharking laws, illegal gambling operations, and how to properly report financial crimes to law enforcement. The next morning, while she was at work, I made several phone calls. First to the police financial crimes unit, then to the FBI's white-collar crime division, and finally to the state attorney general's office. I provided them with everything she'd given me, plus some additional research I'd done on this man's background. Turns out, he'd been on their radar for years, but they'd never had enough evidence to build a solid case against him. I also called a lawyer to discuss my options regarding the house and our financial situation. He explained that any contract signed under duress or as part of illegal activities would likely be voided, but it would take time and legal action to resolve. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, they had enough evidence to move forward with arrests. I was at work when it happened. My phone started buzzing with calls from my wife, but I let them go to voicemail. When I finally listened to the messages, I could hear the panic in her voice. She was calling from the police station. She'd been brought in for questioning as part of the investigation into the loan shark's operation. She was alternating between crying and screaming, demanding to know what I'd done and begging me to call her back. I deleted the messages and went back to work. Update 1. The calls continued for 3 days. My wife was released after questioning, but she came home to find that I'd moved out. I'd taken my personal belongings and left her a note explaining that I'd filed for divorce and would be communicating only through my attorney going forward. She showed up at my temporary apartment that weekend, pounding on the door and demanding I let her in. I called the police and had her removed for trespassing. Her loan shark boyfriend wasn't so lucky. He was arrested along with several associates and charged with running an illegal gambling operation, loan sharking, extortion, and several other crimes. The investigation revealed that my wife was just one of dozens of people he'd been exploiting. My lawyer was right about the house contracts. Since they were part of a legal activity, they were voided, and our home was returned to us. Of course, by us, I mean me, since I was moving forward with divorce proceedings. The financial damage was significant, but not insurmountable. The credit cards and other debts were substantial, but I had a good job and could manage the payments. The lawyer suggested that since the debts were incurred without my knowledge as part of a legal activity, I might not be responsible for all of them. My wife's family started reaching out, trying to convince me to work things out with her. They argued that she was sick, that gambling addiction was a disease, that she needed support rather than abandonment. I explained to them that I might have been willing to help her through a gambling addiction, but she'd made choices that went far beyond just placing bets. She'd chosen to enter into a sexual relationship with a criminal to finance her habit. She'd chosen to risk our home and our future without telling me. She'd chosen to live a double life for months while looking me in the eye every day. Those weren't just symptoms of addiction. They were betrayals that showed a complete lack of respect for our marriage and for me as a person. Update 2. The trial process took several months, during which my wife was required to testify against her former lover. She tried to minimize her involvement, claiming she was just a victim of his manipulation, but the evidence painted a different picture. Text messages showed that she'd been an active participant in planning some of his schemes. She'd helped him identify other potential victims from her social circles and had even assisted in collecting debts from people who couldn't pay. She wasn't just sleeping with him to pay off her own debts. She'd become part of his criminal organization. This information came out during the discovery phase of the criminal trial, and it changed everything for me. I'd thought she was a gambling addict who'd made desperate choices. Instead, she was someone who'd actively participated in victimizing other people. I shared this information with my divorce attorney, who used it to strengthen our case for dissolving the marriage with me, keeping most of our assets. Her family stopped calling after the details of her involvement became public. Apparently, some of the people she'd helped target were friends of theirs, people from our community who'd lost their homes and savings to the same operation that had temporarily claimed ours. The loan shark was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Several of his associates received shorter sentences. My wife was offered a plea deal to testify against them, which kept her out of prison but resulted in probation, community service, and restitution payments. By the time the criminal cases were resolved, our divorce was nearly final. She'd been living with her sister and working at a retail job to pay her legal fees and court-ordered restitution. She made one final attempt to reconcile, showing up at my office to beg for another chance. She claimed she'd learned her lesson, that she was getting help for her gambling addiction, that she wanted to make things right between us. I listened to everything she had to say, then explained that her gambling addiction wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that she was the kind of person who could sleep with a criminal, help him victimize innocent people, and gamble away our future without feeling any remorse until she got caught. I told her that even if I could forgive the cheating, even if I could forgive the financial betrayal, I couldn't forgive the fact that she'd helped destroy other families to protect herself. She started crying and asking what she was supposed to do now, how she was supposed to rebuild her life. I told her that wasn't my problem anymore. Update 3. The divorce was finalized 8 months after her initial confession. I kept the house, most of our assets, and my dignity. She kept her debts, her criminal record, and the consequences of her choices. I spent some time in therapy working through the betrayal and figuring out how to trust people again. The therapist helped me understand that what happened wasn't about anything I did or didn't do. Some people, when faced with problems, look for solutions that don't hurt others. Other people look for solutions that protect themselves regardless of who else gets hurt. My ex-wife was clearly in the second category. I started dating again after about a year. It took time to feel comfortable being vulnerable with someone new, but eventually I met someone who restored my faith in the possibility of an honest relationship. My ex-wife, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, struggled significantly after our divorce. Her criminal record made it difficult to find decent employment. Her gambling addiction continued to be a problem, leading to additional financial and legal troubles. Her family relationships were permanently damaged by her actions. She reached out to me a few times over the years, usually when she was in some new crisis and hoping I might help her. I never responded to these attempts at contact. Some people might think I was too harsh, that I should have tried to help her rebuild her life after she paid her debt to society. But I learned something important from this whole experience. There's a difference between someone who makes mistakes and someone who makes choices that destroy other people's lives. My ex-wife didn't just make mistakes. She made calculated decisions to prioritize her immediate wants over everyone else's well-being. She was willing to sacrifice our marriage, our home, our future, and other people's financial security to continue gambling and avoid facing consequences for her actions. When someone shows you who they really are through their choices, especially when they think no one is watching, you should believe them. I don't regret calling the police. I don't regret divorcing her. I don't regret refusing to help her when she faced the natural consequences of her actions. Her confession that night in our kitchen wasn't just about an affair or even about gambling addiction. It was a revelation about her fundamental character, about what she was willing to do to other people when it served her purposes. The loan shark went to prison because he was a criminal who exploited vulnerable people. My ex-wife avoided prison but lost everything else because she chose to become his accomplice rather than face her problems honestly. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if she'd come to me when her gambling first became a problem, if she'd asked for help instead of turning to a criminal. We might have worked through it together, gotten her treatment, rebuilt our finances as a team. But that would have required her to be the kind of person who valued our relationship more than her immediate comfort, who was willing to face embarrassment and consequences rather than victimize others. The woman who confessed to me that night wasn't that kind of person. She was someone who could look me in the eye for months while betraying everything our marriage was supposed to represent. I'm grateful she finally told me the truth, not because it saved our marriage, but because it saved me from wasting any more of my life with someone who was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of person I wanted to be. 3 years later, I'm remarried to someone who shares my values about honesty, responsibility, and treating other people with respect. We built our relationship on a foundation of trust and transparency that I never had with my first wife, even before her gambling and criminal activities. Sometimes people ask if I ever feel guilty about what happened to my ex-wife after I reported her boyfriend to the authorities. The answer is no. She made her choices, and I made mine. The difference is that my choices were aimed at stopping people from being victimized, while hers were aimed at continuing to victimize people to protect herself. I sleep well at night knowing that I chose to be the kind of person who stands up to criminals rather than enabling them. That's more than my ex-wife can say. The house we bought together is now the home I share with my new wife. We've remodeled it completely, removing any trace of my previous life there. It's a symbol of how it's possible to rebuild something beautiful from the wreckage left by people who care more about themselves than anyone else. My ex-wife's confession that night changed everything about how I understand relationships and trust. But in the end, it led me to a better life with someone who deserves my love and gives it back honestly in return. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best outcomes, not because the betrayal itself was good, but because it forces you to stop accepting less than you deserve and start building something better. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe and hype button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe and press the hype button. Thanks in advance.